All right, how's everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel, and we do educational videos on this channel. Most of them relate to great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, cosmologies, grand unified theories, anything that purports to, talk about how everything fits together and works all at once. And these are for helping you out with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview. Today is our 564th video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory from one Dewey Bernard Larson. And Mr. Larson was an American engineer. And in 1959, he proposed his two fundamental postulates about how he believed the universe operated. He was one of the few scientists to propose a universe cosmology based upon motion. Larson's first postulate states that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. And basically, the universe is made out of motion, not matter, not energy. And motion is the relationship between space and time. You can see that in speed. I was running at 10 miles per hour. 10 miles of space in 1 hour of time. That is speed. But Larson doesn't just stop at speed. All of our basic properties, scientific entities or quantities are forms of motion. Matter is a form of motion. Energy is a form of motion. Momentum is a form of motion. Pressure is a form of motion. Power is a form of motion. Electric charge is a form of motion. And they all can be expressed in fractions, with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. Space and time can come in multiple dimensions in those fractions. And also, when Larson is referring to motion, he's referring to kind of a more generic form of motion that he calls scalar motion. It's kind of like an internal motion, always existing motion. It can be envisioned using a balloon that you put dots on with a magic marker. If you blow up the balloon, all of the dots will be moving away from each other, meaning that all of the dots are moving in every direction, no specific direction. Really, the only direction that you can impute is in or out. Outward when you're blowing up the balloon, inward if you're contracting the balloon. Those are analogous to the 2 major forms of motion in the reciprocal system. The outward motion is called the progression, and the progression is always occurring. It is omnipresent and eternal. It occurs at all times in all places, and it occurs at the rate of 1 unit of space per 1 unit of time, which is also known as the speed of light. And so that is always occurring everywhere, and that is the source of everything in this universe. But that source is not manifested until it is reversed and turned to an inward motion. So it needs to be reversed in 3 dimensions. And that inward motion, Larson refers to that as gravitation. Now, Larson has books on physics and astrophysics and chemistry and astronomy. He's also got a book on metaphysics, philosophy, religion, psychology, biology. And he has 2 books on economics. We're reading one of those books today that is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. Larson uses these same principles of a universe of motion in all his books. So this universe of motion is a generalized theory, and he applies it to the economic system. The economic system is a dynamic system in motion, and our two reciprocal entities are production and consumption. And Larson attempts to put the economic profession or the discipline of economics onto a scientific basis as opposed to a sociological or social science basis. It is a system that has equations that are exact mathematically, and the economic system is something that can be controlled and manipulated with more or less minute detail, up down to minute details, if you know how it operates. And so Larson talks about that in this book. If you'd like to get a better description of the reciprocal system itself, you want to watch any or many of my first 474 videos on the subject. If you'd like to get back to the start of this book and go all the way through, start with chapter 1, which occurred about 6 weeks ago back in the archives. Otherwise, you can tune in here and just, get your snapshot. Larson usually does a pretty good job of explaining background information. And you probably can wing it from here and learn something just in this one self-contained video as well. We are in the middle of chapter 18, or toward the end of chapter 18, called Wartime Economics. But however praiseworthy the motives of the controllers may be, attempts to hold down the cost of living by price control are futile, and to a large degree aggravate the situation they are intended to correct. As brought out in the previous discussion, price is an effect. Mathematically, it is the quotient obtained when we divide the purchasing power entering the markets by the volume of goods. And direct control of the general price level is therefore mathematically impossible. Any attempt at such a control necessarily suffers the fate of all of man's attempts to accomplish the impossible. Some prices can be controlled individually, to be sure, but whatever reductions are accomplished in the prices of these items are promptly counterbalanced by increases in the prices of uncontrolled items. The general level of prices is determined by the relation of the purchasing power entering the markets to the volume of goods produced for civilian use. And since the goods volume is essentially fixed in wartime, the only kind of an effective control that can be exercised over the general price level is one which operates through curtailment of the available purchasing power. Even if it were possible to establish prices for all goods and administer such a complex control system, whatever results might be accomplished would not be due to the price control itself, but to the fact that the excess purchasing power above that required to buy the available goods at the established prices would be, in effect, frozen, as it would have no value for current buying. Furthermore, price control is not merely a futile waste of time and effort. It actually operates in such a manner as to intensify the problem which brought it into being. The relative market prices of individual items are determined by supply and demand considerations. And if one of these prices shows a tendency to rise preferentially, this means that the demand for this item at the existing price is greater than the supply. If the price is permitted to rise The higher price results in a decrease in the demand and generally increases the supply of the item, thus reestablishing equilibrium. Holding down the price by means of some kind of an arbitrary control accentuates the demand, which is already too high, and restricts the supply, which is already too low. Surely no one needs a course in systematic economics, says Frank Knight, to teach him that high prices, to teach him that high prices stimulate production and reduce consumption, and vice versa. The obvious consequence is that any enforced price above the free market level will create a surplus, and one below it a shortage, entailing waste and generating problems more complex than any the measure is supposed to solve. End quote. This is another place where the economists have allowed themselves to be governed by emotional reactions rather than by logical consideration of the facts. Samuelson, for example, calls attention to an instance in which the price of sugar was controlled, so-called, at 7 cents per pound, where the market conditions were such that the price might otherwise have gone as high as 20 cents per pound. This high price, he tells us, quote, would have represented a rather heavy tax on the poor who could least afford it, and it would only have added fuel to an inflationary spiral in the cost of living, with all sorts of inflationary reactions on workers' demands, and so forth, end quote. In analyzing this statement, let us first bear in mind that a high price for sugar does not deprive anyone of the sugar which he actually needs. As all the textbooks tell us, and as we know without being told, the most urgent wants are satisfied preferentially. An increase in the cost of any item, therefore, results in a reduction in the consumption of the least essential item in the family budget. A rise in the price of sugar thus has no more significance than an increase in the price of that least essential item. Higher prices for any component of a consumer's purchases reduce the standard of living that he is able to maintain. To the extent that sugar enters into non-essentials, such as candy, the consumption of sugar will be reduced irrespective of where the price rise takes place. But to the extent that sugar is regarded as essential to the diet, the reduction will take place in the consumption of other goods. In view of the severe general inflation that was taking place at the same time, the excessive concern about the possible rise in the price of sugar, a very minor item in the consumer's expenditures, is rather ridiculous. It is clearly an emotional reaction rather than a sober economic judgment. Whatever tax the sugar price increase may have imposed on the poor was simply a part of an immensely greater tax due to the general inflation of the price level by reason of government financial policy. Furthermore, Samuelson, in common with many of his colleagues, apparently takes it for granted that an increase in the price of one commodity will exert an influence that will tend to cause other prices to rise. It will add fuel to an inflationary spiral, as he puts it, whereas the fact is that any increase in the price of one commodity reduces the purchasing power available for buying other goods, and hence must cause a decrease in some other price or prices. Unless the total available purchasing power is increased in some manner, the average price cannot rise. Of course, under inflationary conditions, the available money purchasing power is being increased, and all prices are moving in the upward direction, but each separate increase absorbs a part of the excess purchasing power. It does not contribute toward further increases. The snowball effect visualized by Samuelson is non-existent. An increase in the price of sugar is an effect, not a cause. When the government draws large quantities of money from the reservoirs and pours it into the purchasing power stream going to the markets, the average price must go up no matter how effectively the prices of sugar and other special items are controlled. Any rise in the price of an individual item that exceeds the inflationary rise in the general price level is due to a lack of equilibrium between the supply and demand for that item. If the price is arbitrarily fixed at a point below the equilibrium level, this is a bargain price for the consumer, and it increases the already excessive demand, while the already inadequate supply is further reduced, since producers are, in effect, penalized for producing controlled rather than uncontrolled items. As an example of what this leads to, the price of men's standard white shirts was controlled during World War II, whereas non-standard shirts, such as sport shirts, were partially or wholly exempt from control. The result could easily have been foreseen by anyone who took the trouble to analyze the situation. The manufacturers made little or no profit on the production of standard shirts, and therefore held the production to a minimum. During much of the war period, they were almost impossible to obtain in the ordinary course of business, and those who wanted shirts had to buy fancy sport shirts, which were available in practically unlimited quantities at much higher prices. The net result was that the consumer, for whose benefit the controls were ostensibly imposed, not only paid a very high price for his shirts, but had to accept something that he did not want. This is not an unusual case. It is the normal way in which price control operates. The controls produce shortages, and the consumers are then forced to pay high prices for unsatisfactory substitutes. Samuelson makes a comment which reveals some of the thinking that lies behind the seemingly inexplicable advocacy of price control by so many of the economists, the very group who ought to be the most aware of its futility. Following his discussion of the sugar illustration and related items, he tells us, the breakdown of the price mechanism during war gives us a new understanding of its remarkable efficiency in normal times, end quote. It is not entirely clear whether it is the abnormal rise in the price of sugar and other scarce commodities that he calls a breakdown, or whether it is the general rise in the price level. But in either case, he is accusing the price mechanism of breaking down when, in fact, it is doing exactly what it is supposed to do and what should be done in the best interest of the economy. When the government is pumping large amounts of credit money into the markets, as it did in World War II, prices must rise enough to absorb the additional money purchasing power. The function of the price mechanism is to cause the necessary price increase to take place and to allocate it among the various goods in accordance with the individual supply and demand situations. The mechanism simply responds automatically to the actions which are taken with respect to the purchasing power flow. It is not a device for holding down the cost of living. In order to prevent a rise in the general price level, if this seems desirable, measures must be taken to draw off the excess money purchasing power and either liquidate it or immobilize it for the time being. If Samuelson's diagnosis of a breakdown refers to the greater than average rise in the prices of certain commodities such as sugar, he is equally wrong in his conclusions, as the price mechanism is doing its job here. It is reducing the demand for these scarce items and increasing the supply. The price rise will force some consumers to reduce their use of these commodities. Of course, but when productive facilities are diverted from civilian use to war purposes, the consumers must reduce their standard of living in one way or another. Someone must use less of the scarce items. The truth is that the price system does its job in wartime with the same remarkable efficiency as in times of peace. It does what has to be done when the results are unwelcome, as well as when they are more to our liking. Samuelson and his colleagues are blaming the price system for results that are due to government financial policies. Under some circumstances, control over the prices of certain individual items is justified as a means of preventing the producers or owners of commodities in short supply from taking undue advantage of the supply situation. Control over the prices of automobile tires during World War II, for example, was entirely in order, but it should be realized that the consumers were not benefited in any way from the fixing of the prices. Whatever they saved in the cost of tires simply added to the amount of money purchasing power available for the purchase of the limited amount of other goods allocated to civilian use, and thus raised the prices of these other goods. Price control for the purpose of preventing excessive windfall gains is sound practice, but price control for the purpose of holding down the cost of living is futile. The contention will no doubt be raised that the savings to the customer by reason of controlled prices of sugar, tires, etc. will not necessarily be plowed back into the markets, but savings deposited in a bank are loaned to other individuals and spent. Most types of investment involve purchases in some market. Thus, savings applied in either of these ways remain in the active purchasing power stream. It is true that the amount which is saved may be applied to the purchase of government bonds, in which case it is removed from the stream flowing to the markets. However, it should be remembered that the only excuse for price control is the existence of a period of economic stress in which the general standard of living has to be reduced. Under the circumstances, it is not likely that any more than a relatively small fraction of the decrease in outlay for the controlled commodities will be applied toward purchase of government securities. We cannot expect the poor, to whom Samuelson refers, to buy war bonds with what they save on the cost of sugar. Even in the short-run situation, therefore, price control has little effect in reducing the purchasing power flow. In the long run, any saving that is made by purchase of government bonds, hoarding of money, or other input into the money and credit reservoirs is entirely illusory, so far as the consuming public is concerned. Such savings never enable consumers as a whole to buy any additional goods. The so-called saving by accumulation of government credit instruments merely postpones the price rise for a time. The only thing that these savings can do, when and if they are used, is to raise prices. In general, wartime price control and rationing should be applied in conjunction, if they are used at all. If rationing of a commodity is required, control of the price of that commodity is practically essential. not because this does the consumer any good, as it does not, but to prevent some individuals from getting undeserved windfalls at the expense of producers of other goods. Conversely, if the supply situation is not serious enough to necessitate rationing, there is no justification for price control. In fact, the necessity for rationing is all too often a result of scarcities caused by price controls. In the case of non-commodity items, such as rentals, the criterion should be whether or not the normal increase of supply in response to a higher demand is prevented by restrictions on new construction of other government actions. Where the control of prices is justified on this basis, however, the price should never be set below the amount which conforms to the general price level. For example, if the pre-war rental of a house was $300 per month and the general price level increased 20%, the controlled rent should be raised to $300. I would think it would be $360 per month. It says $300 per month, and the general price level increases 20%. The controlled rent should be raised to $360 per month. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I think I have some semi-emergency situation to deal with right now. So I'm going to stop right there, and we're going to finish the rest of this chapter, which we're almost at the end of, here in the next couple minutes. And, I mean, we'll finish it tomorrow. And move on to chapter 19. So thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.